everyone, I'm David. Thanks for having me here today. Really excited to take part in this virtual session today. I'm actually trying something a little bit new today, so I hope the experiment goes well. You're kind of like my guinea pigs with this content. I'm actually going to start with a sort of a faux pas. The worst way to start a talk is with a disclaimer, so let's do it anyway. So today's talk is called Leading Through Change, Building Self-Learning Organizations. And I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to talk about. I'm actually not going to talk about organizational models that allow to build self-learning organizations. Like, I'm not going to talk about B Corps, holacracy, teal organizations, beyond budgeting, like participatory organizations. If you want to talk org design, contextual design, I'd recommend Aaron Dignan's book, Brave New Work. Instead, so during this talk, I'm actually going to try to change your mind on something. Even if it's only for 5% of you listening, I'm going to try to change your mind. I'm going to try to convince you that investing in learning for you specifically, for your teams and your organization as a whole is actually the highest ROI project or activity that you can undertake. One more time, that investing in learning of capabilities, building capabilities in your teams is the highest predictable long ROI, and you should be doing more of it, and you should be investing more time into it. And too often it's an afterthought, or we think it will happen sort of organically or naturally. After I attempt to convince you, I'll try to underline why we don't invest more in learning and challenge you on the steps to actually get started and how to run your first experiment around this. Essentially making steps towards building what we call a learning organization, which are basically the most powerful, resilient, innovative companies in the world in terms of adapting and thriving within a context of change. So I'm going to start off with a short introduction. I know everybody hates intros, and I'll make it really quick, but who am I and what do we do at Growth Tribe? So I'm the co-founder and currently head of growth at a company called Growth Tribe. We're dedicated to keeping organizations competitive, learning abilities, and we have a special focus on making learning relevant, linked to business objectives, and most importantly, enjoyable, making learning experience. We work with companies who want to serve customers better and in a more agile manner. And we focus on 5 main clusters of hard and soft skills of the digital world. So around data, around digital, around the mindset, around innovation, and around customer experience. We've got offices throughout Europe, and we evolve both online and offline. So we provide both online and offline learning solutions, in person and online. So who do we work for and with? We work for startups, we work for scale-ups, and we have a strong focus on the enterprise. We're an enterprise learning partner. We also have public courses, but we have a very strong focus on larger corporations, larger organizations. Okay, let's get started. So I'm actually going to start with one of my favorite mental models of all time. This is a mental model that I've got like tattooed in my brain next to my desk as well. And it's to help me know if I'm focusing on the right thing at any given time. It's called the productivity pyramid. I actually prefer to call it the ROE pyramid, the return on energy pyramid. It's one of those self-help things, but it's really effective for me. Basically, it breaks down a day, a week, a month, or a year into 4 types of activities based on the return on energy, the ROI of these activities, the return on energy of these activities. You have limited time, right? Limited energy. So how are you using that time or that energy? On the top of the pyramid, we have the stuff called the negative ROE. It's the activities that have negative return on investment, that are sort of detrimental. The second part are things that have positive ROE, but the return on energy is kind of low. It's like a low euro per hour value. The third part is the high ROI activities. These have high euro per hour value. Now, typically we're quite good at allocating our time on these 3 different parts. However, very often we don't allocate enough energy or time, deliberate time, on the bottom section. And the final part is the high LTV activities, the high lifetime value activities. We're talking massive gains, but often on a much longer time scale. So for example, actively fostering relationships, key relationships in business, Or, this is also, by the way, why many couples don't make it. It's through lack of time investment, and it starts crumbling a little. Or investment in breakthrough ideas. So spending time to actually sit and think with no distractions. Moments like those, it's like the 0.01% of moments that yield 50% of the results. Or deep work, like actually focusing on deep work. How much time have you dedicated to these high LTV activities this week, for example? And the biggest one here is actually learning. Learning has one of the highest personal lifetime values you can imagine. So why is that? Well, as you know, we live in a knowledge economy. In a knowledge economy, knowledge is the greatest resource to have. And knowledge is achieved through learning. With more knowledge, we make better decisions and more creative decisions. In a knowledge economy, learning and thinking are the single most important and best long-term investments you can make for yourself and for your career. And it might seem super obvious. Maybe this seems super obvious when I say it. Yet after going through higher education, the majority of us grossly underinvest in learning. The EU average participation, for example, in learning for adults is a little bit above 10% on average. In my opinion, it should be closer to 80%. Now, you might be thinking, I spend time learning, my teams do, but let me ask you this question. Look in the mirror 2 seconds. What percentage of your time do you actually spend on deliberate learning? Look back at the past day, the past week, or the past month. And I'm not talking about learning on the job by osmosis. I'm talking about deliberate learning of new capabilities, of new skills, ones that will expand your cognitive bandwidth, ones that will improve your everyday decision-making in our knowledge economy, or even just random ones like theology or anthropology or biology. How much time have you and or your teams actually spent on deliberate learning this week or this month? And I find it quite baffling because once again, we live in a knowledge economy driven by tech. The tools and knowledge at our disposal are actually greater than ever. This is a really interesting insight from Josh Bersin, who's considered kind of like the godfather of workplace learning. He found that on average, the average person spends 24 minutes a week for deliberate learning. So if we look at the average number of hours worked in your country, that's actually less than 1%. Less than 1% of time is spent on such a high lifetime value activity. So once again, how much time have you actually spent on deliberate learning this week or this month? Now, I was mentioning that we live in a knowledge economy that's driven by tech nowadays. The digitalization since the beginning of the ICT revolution in 1971, the tools and knowledge at our disposal are greater than ever, and there's a gap that's forming. And a gap that's formed because we can't keep up. But like with any gap, this is a huge opportunity. And from a purely capitalistic frame of mind, you don't need to fill that gap perfectly for yourself or your team. Don't worry. You just need to seize that gap and be a little bit better than the competition. There's a real opportunity there. So this one's interesting. Why do we underspend? Well, part of it, not all of it, but why do we underinvest? Why? It's because we can't see the return on investment. We can't feel it. It's because of the same cognitive bias that stops us from taking action on climate change, for example. It's called temporal bias. It's also known as the urgency bias. We discount the impact of things on the long term, and we focus more on short-term gains. Now, temporal discounting explains many of our unhealthy habits, despite having healthy intentions. So in short, we tend to focus on short-term gains versus long-term gains. And those who can fight this bias, well, they tend to win. And this bias, we have it at the individual level, for sure, but we also have it at the organizational level. Organizations underspend on learning. And that ROI on the bottom line, on release cycle times, on product development, on organizational performance, on innovation, on growth, even on overperformance, but also on the bottom line, has been proven and demonstrated again and again. So let's take this study, for example. This is one of my favorite ones at the moment. It's done by MIT and Deloitte. They did a recent study of digital transformation for 4,300 executives. The most successful, fast-growing, digitally enabled companies in the study, they differentiated by one thing. They've transformed the way individuals and organizations learn new capabilities. And this means learning all the time, not just once a year. Amongst the highest performing in the study, 73% of employees were updating their skills every 6 months, and 44% they were updating them continuously. So that's almost half. In other words, today's successful companies are those who learn fast, learn well, and basically learn all the time. And the literature on the ROI of learning is heavy and well documented. Got a bunch of studies to prove this. We'll be linking to a lot of these studies after the talk if you're interested in getting into the nitty-gritty. However, paradoxically, most organizations are still grossly investing. So I pulled up some stats. Less than 3% of Fortune 1000 companies have HR or L&D represented on the board. L&D doesn't have a seat at the table. Mid-size and large organizations, so that's 500 people to 10,000 plus, spend a tiny 714 euros per year on employee learning. According to this beautiful CEB research, only 1 in 10 companies have a true learning culture. According to the same research, only 20% of employees demonstrate effective learning behaviors, and most CEOs have no clue what the impact of their learning efforts actually is. And I'm not going to bore you, but there's a bunch more where that came from. Now I'm going to throw this back at you. As a team leader, like as a manager, as a business unit manager, as an executive, when is the last time that you built a business case around learning? If you've done, congrats, but data shows that the grand majority of you have never done it, never taken it seriously. It doesn't even have to be an entire business case. When's the last time you built an experiment around a learning program or project where learning is the key growth driver? Now, let's put it this way. If we look at an organization, it's a sort of living organism, right? And take that analogy a little bit further. Let's look at the cellular level. The molecular level is the individual within an organization. It's basically you, it's me, it's us. We are the cellular component of the organization. And none of the tech, the tooling, the processes, or even the strategy are possible without that individual unit, without the talent and the capabilities of you and of me. But we don't focus enough on updating the learning and capabilities that allow for new product development, new services, business models, financial performance, or refining a core business, for example. Now imagine, for example, for a second, an organization where each individual component, each human, was a lifelong learner, capable of making better decisions based on superior and updated knowledge. An organization from the bottom up is self-learning, that organically adapts and learns as it goes. Now that company becomes not only self-learning, but it also becomes more and more self-driving. And self-driving organizations adapt better and faster within context in which they evolve. And of course, it's never that perfect. It's never that perfect, beautiful story, but it doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be just a little bit better, a little bit faster than others. Now, at the individual level, we talk about the compound returns of learning, since learning leads to better decision making. Now, if you know anything about compound interest rates in finance, you'll understand the massive returns it has on the long run. Now, imagine these compound returns not just for one person, but across your team, across your department, across the entire organization. Imagine the impact. So what's actually stopping us? What's actually blocking us from investing more? And we need to look at what's blocking us, because the obstacle is the way. So what's blocking people is there's 3 main things. What's blocking people within organizations from spending more time on learning is, they should be doing this on the job, right? Or during their spare time. Well, actually, that's wrong. It's an organization's role, it's a leader's role to enable learning, to invest in learning. I'll cover the top 3 blockers. The first one is the presence or the lack of a growth mindset. Growth mindset is something studied and coined by Carol Dweck over 30 years ago in her book Mindset. It's been closely studied at the organizational level through research papers. That mindset that we are forever a work in progress as individuals or as organizations. And funnily enough, this is not usually a problem. This growth mindset is not usually a problem within the execution side of the company. It's usually, but not always, but usually lacking in the higher echelons of the organization within leadership, where their capabilities have decayed a little bit faster than they'd like to admit. And maybe on this note, it's time to look in the mirror a little bit. What behavior as a leader do I demonstrate? What type of culture do we have? The key characteristics of growth mindset teams and organizations has been studied. So which one are you? Do you value status and a few key players, or do you see the company through a wide-ranging potential, waiting to be unlocked? Do you have rigid planning and rigid control, or is there an appetite for risk-taking, dealing with uncertainty, what we like to call autonomous alignment? Another key characteristics, are you more likely to hire from the outside, to buy talent, as we call it, or are you more likely to hire from within your teams, within ranks, and value potential and a passion for learning? It might also be time to look at yourselves, whether you have the right capabilities, whether your capabilities as a leader are up to par with the modern digital world. I mean, sure, leaders nowadays, they can manage a profit and loss account, but can you talk data? I mean, do you understand, for example, I don't know, the different applications of supervised and unsupervised machine learning? Just intuitively, do you understand it? Can you design an experiment? Do you truly understand digital channels? And the two big ones where we usually see a lot of pain typically have to do with data and digital channels. Those are like the 20% that give the 80% of the pain at leaders level. The second blocker is typically time dedication and incentives to learn. So here, against popular myth, you don't actually learn most of your capabilities on the job. You need to make deliberate time for learning. So forward-thinking companies create time and actually invest in their people, invest in that learning. For example, AT&T's company-wide reskilling program. AT&T realized they couldn't attract the best talent anymore. The best talent didn't want to work for AT&T. They wanted to work for LinkedIn or for Uber. So they thought, okay, we actually need to start building capabilities internally. There's also Airbnb's Analytics Academy, beautiful example. Or like many of the local examples we are helping drive here in Europe, like Albert Heijn's Digital Academy, or the Finance Frontrunner Academy, or this insurance company's Customer-Centric Academy, or the Philips University. But these are all big programs, and this might seem like a really a big project to implement, but you can also do this at team level. You can also start at the team level. And I mean, we've done this again and again. What we do is we basically take a consulting budget and we turn it into a learning budget. You get faster and more durable results. We're embedding the capabilities into the DNA of the teams. And in all of these cases, leaders clearly made dedicated time and budget available for learning. And guess what? It's a win-win. I showed some of the results here. It's a win for the business and it's a win for the team members. What about the third obstacle? This is possibly the biggest one of them all. The third obstacle is the paradox of choice. Unfortunately, learning doesn't come with a manual. So it's like that toothpaste aisle, we are confronted with a paradox of choice. What in God's name should I be learning next and how deep should I go? I like to compare learning to looking for a diamond in a bag of broken glass, really difficult to identify. So it's actually your responsibility as a leader to help answer this question. What should each function be learning next according to their role, and how deep should they go on each of these capabilities? This is actually the hardest one to solve, and I'll give you some steps on how you can start figuring this out. I'll try to give you some action points if you actually want to take this type of action towards enabling a learning organization. And we're going to treat it as an experiment. So how do we take action? What I'd like to do is, here's my challenge to you, basically. I'd encourage you to build this into an experiment, a mini business case of sorts. So for example, your experiment could be, I want to invest in making our team more customer-centric and more data-driven to better serve customers. Then you would write your hypothesis. I believe that by investing in experimentation, in customer-centric and data capabilities, we can increase revenue and engagement on our product or service X. To verify this, what are we going to do? We're going to outline business objectives. We're going to create a learning path and upskill the team over, let's say, 6 weeks. Let's give ourselves 6 weeks to get some results. And then what are we going to measure? Well, here's what we could measure. So here you would put your KPIs linked to your business objective, increase in revenue, increase in engagement, whatever KPIs linked to your business objective. And How do we know if we're right? How do we know if we're successful? Well, we create some minimum success criteria. So you can think of, I don't know, gathering learnings for the first month, or your revenue grew, or your engagement grew by X%. We hit our KPIs. Now, you can also, this one's interesting, you can think of what possible blockers might come your way. So maybe lack of budget, or maybe the temporal bias that I talked about before. And this experiment card doesn't need to be perfect, right? You can make this sort of a minimal viable experiment. So this is my challenge to you, and I'll repeat it at the end as well. Now, if you run an experiment like this, next thing I'd like you to do is to start with company objectives. Too often we start with, yeah, let's implement LinkedIn Learning all over the organization. Let's start with company objectives. So for example, we want to be more data-driven to increase profitability, and we want to be more customer-centric to drive engagement, right? Just think of your own example. Typically, this is linked to your company global strategy. Then think about how those are linked to the business objectives. So for the data-driven part, it might be driving sales by focusing on more profitable channels, for example, or using historical data to predict lifetime value. For customer centricity, maybe it's we want to increase conversions on key products. Now comes the interesting part. How are your business objectives linked to behaviors that you want to see happen within the company? Because essentially learning is influencing behavior. Maybe you want people to start taking more data-informed decisions. Just have, when you take data-informed decisions, you have shorter meetings, there's less discussion and more insights. Or maybe you want to actively conduct better and faster user research. Maybe you want your teams to finally start taking more risks. Once you've identified those behavioral objectives, what type of behavior you want to change, you can think about how those behavioral objectives translate into learning objectives. What could people learn and to do better? So for example, on the data side, it's having stronger grasp of analytics, an intuitive understanding of how data works, talking the lingo, being able to intuitively understand what the options of data are, how you can actually use it as a tool, or using business intelligence tools for descriptive analytics, or getting better at data visualization and data storytelling so that your data teams can actually communicate to the rest of the organization, to other departments. That's a huge one, by the way. We call it the last mile problem. On the customer-centric side, maybe it's knowing how to design an experiment, knowing how to run user research more effectively, or analyzing experiments, analyzing a bit of data, how to understand the customer better. And finally, the last part, and unfortunately, this is usually the part that people start with when building, when saying, I want my teams to increase their capabilities. What tools and methods do I want to mix to reach these learning and behavioral objectives? And sky's the limit here. I mean, there's so much available nowadays, from in-person learning, online courses, coaching, mentoring, books, virtual classrooms, peer-to-peer. It's a hybrid approach, a little bit of online, a little bit of offline, a little bit of macro learning, and a little bit of nano learning. We love designing these, by the way. We're like learning journey designers. And it's quite an amazing exercise to do this, to run through this chart that I've shown you here, starting with company objectives. And I really hope you'll give it a shot. You'll really start to feel the power of how you can influence behavior and through actual capability building. And like I said, it's a win-win, because it's a win for the people who are learning, and it's a win for the organization. Terrible expression, by the way, win-win. Need to find another one. A tip here, so this is kind of unconventional, but small tip if you want to build this experiment. Training is typically associated with soft skills. When people say training, we think soft skills like management training, communication training, etc. If you're going to launch this experiment, I'd launch it with what we call fast skills. Now, I'm not saying fast skills are better than slow skills. However, slow skills are slower to acquire and slower to show ROI. With fast skills, they're equally important, but with fast skills, you can start applying it the very next day or the very next week. And we have results within a sprint. It creates for a much better internal use case. So maybe start with fast skills rather than the slower skills. And maybe start with consumer-facing teams like customer experience teams, marketing teams, data teams. You get results faster. Another tip is to measure where your skills are right now. Now, you know how you wouldn't accept a treatment from a doctor without getting diagnosed first, without running a series of tests? Well, it's the same thing with a learning experiment, with a learning program. We need to find where the gaps are, where the biggest needs are. We call this a capability scan. Now, you can do this yourselves with some interviews and some gut feeling even, but we've actually built a tool that does this. It's an assessment that delivers individual results as well as team results. So for example, here you see a team, you see a specific capability that we want to grow within a team. You can see where one individual scores, you can see where another individual scores, and here you can see how the team scores as a whole. And you do that across all of the important capabilities, so you get an idea of where your weaknesses are and where your strengths are. By the way, starting in actually 4 minutes, we have another session at this URL here, grow.ac/GTExpo. That looks weird, but it's a short link. So it's grow.ac/GTExpo. And we have Sam and Sabina, who are running a session about this in 3 minutes now at this link. If you don't have time to go to the session, we have a much lighter version of this. By the way, this is all free. Huh? I'm not actually pitching here. We have a much lighter version of this for managers of data teams and marketing teams. So specifically for managers of data teams and marketing teams, you can go to this URL, grow.ac/scan, and you can get a first version of this capability scan. The one I showed you before, it takes a lot more sort of time and investment. But what's fantastic here is when you run through an exercise like this, you see where your strengths and weaknesses are. You can double down on your strengths. So for example, here for data storytelling, I see one individual who's really strong and a few individuals who are a bit weaker. You can like set up a peer-to-peer or a coaching program based on these individuals. And when we see how the capabilities evolved halfway through the learning journey, so what's cool here is when we work with teams, for example, these are the baseline KPIs. So these are where the team is at right now. And then you really start to see the impact of learning. So this is a team that we're working with at the moment. In this example, yeah. And we see how those capabilities evolved halfway through the learning journeys. So halfway through the learning journeys, those capabilities are already being increased. We call it data-driven learning, actually having some data to back up the impact of your learning efforts. It's really quite beautiful because you can see the impact of what you're doing and of the efforts of learning new capabilities. So let's just summarize some of the key insights that we went through. The ROI of learning is huge and it's long-term. Fight against your temporal bias. Even from a personal point of view, try to fight against that short-termism and think long-term. Invest in yourself and in the organization. I challenge you to launch an experiment around building capabilities. Make a little bit of an investment, build an experiment, you will have positive ROI and you will build those capabilities within the DNA of your organization. And by the way, people stick around longer in companies that invest in learning. Be creative, experiment, try to combine knowledge and adopt a growth mindset. Read the book, Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck. Actually, it's just called Mindset. Self-learning organizations become self-driving organizations. Begin with company objectives if you want to run this experiment. What are my company objectives? And then what are the behavioral objectives linked to this? And what are the capabilities? What are the new skills that people need for those behavioral objectives, for those company objectives? Audit your current capabilities. You can start with our simple scan at grow.ac/scan. And if you want more, if you want to take it further, if you want the full capability scan, so we're hosting a session around measuring your team's skills right now. So at 3 p.m. Central Eastern, I don't know how to say it, right now, Amsterdam time. And it's at grow.ac/GTExpo, grow.ac/GTExpo. And it's in our little expo session. So now I'd like to say thank you very much. And I do believe we are permitted to have 3 or 4 minutes of questions that you can put directly into the chat. And I'm happy to answer a few questions for like 3-4 minutes. I think I'm a little bit over time now. It's exactly 30 minutes, but I'm looking at Lucia who's saying that I'm allowed to answer a few questions. I'm allowed, right? If there's any questions. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to stop sharing screen for 2 seconds and I need to go back to the question page to see if there are any questions. Did you see any questions or? Oh yeah, tag Q&A. We're up in the chat. Can you show me real quick? I'm lost. I'm looking. I'm not super smart. Here?
Yeah, up in the chat. Let's see. I think
Down, down, down. Oh, it's tagged. Oh, I understand. Let me find a question. This one? Do you have any tips for integrating learning in small organizations that have to deal with small budgets for learning or limited time because there's a lot of process to deliver? Yeah, I agree. So this two things. One is the limited time. I talked about the temporal bias. We all have limited time. I would dedicate, for example, half a day to learning per week and just force it. Block it in the calendars and force it. It's this form of short-termism. We're chasing targets, I know, and we need to fix bugs and we need to refactor, et cetera, but I would actually force it to create that behavior and incentivize it. A really nice thing we've done internally and that we recommend clients do is to link learning to performance performance sessions. So when you're looking at every 6 months, like how are you doing on performance, not only look at KPIs, but also have some learning KPIs in there. And with regards to budget, I mean, link Udacity, LinkedIn Learning, Blinkist, there's a lot of sort of free options out there. The thing you want to do is follow that chart I showed you, where you start with the company objectives, and then you build those behavioral objectives, and then the learning objectives, and then the tools, and you can just choose through the tools. I hope that answers it. If it doesn't, just add me on LinkedIn, and we can discuss it a little bit more. Thanks, David. Any tips on getting your company to understand now is the perfect time to not cut learning budgets because people have extra hours, not having to travel to and from work? Really good point. So actually what we've seen in our studies that learning budgets are not getting cut. There's been this big wake up that companies need to go more digital. So actually we're starting to see an increase in digital training budgets. I also studied the 2008-2009 recession, and we saw that budgets weren't actually cut. And if they were cut, it was just in hard hit industries where it typically makes sense to not cut learning budgets because people have extra hours not having. Yeah, so we're actually seeing sort of the opposite, that budgets are being increased and it's time to seize that opportunity. We're also seeing governments unlocking budgets across Europe for these reskilling and upskilling, budgets. Thanks for the question, Camille. Okay, I think that's it for the questions. Cool. Thank you very much. Enjoy the next web, and add me on LinkedIn if you have any questions, and have a fantastic day. Bye.